Ever feel like you're trapped? Like the walls are closing in? Imagine that feeling, amplified 1,000 times, within the cold, unforgiving bars of a juvenile detention center. Now, picture the world outside those bars collapsing into chaos, a nightmare you never could have conceived, let alone prepared for. What would you do? Who would you become? This is a story of survival, of guilt, and of an impossible second chance in a world devoured by the undead. If you're brave enough to face the darkness, hit that like button, subscribe for more chilling tales, and let's descend together into this terrifying new reality. The gray. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Everything was gray inside those walls. Gray concrete, gray steel bars, the perpetually overcast sky I could sometimes glimpse through the small, fortified window in my cell. A year. Almost a year I'd been locked away in the Redwood Creek Juvenile Rehabilitation Facility. Rehabilitation. The word felt like a cruel joke echoing off the sterile, sound-dampening walls. It was a prison, plain and simple, designed to contain the dangerous, the broken. And according to the state, that was me. My crime, it played on repeat in my head, a gruesome, never-ending film loop of rage and irreversible consequence. They called me a murderer. The word was branded onto my soul, a scarlet letter invisible to the eye but scorching hot to the touch. Caleb Johnson, murderer. I was 15 when it happened, barely more than a kid, yet old enough, the judge decreed, to understand the gravity of my actions, too young, thankfully, to be thrown into the adult system, but too volatile, too disturbed, to be sent to a standard juvenile hall. Hence, Redwood Creek, a high-security mental institution masquerading as a place of healing. Healing? Another lie. There was therapy, yes. Group sessions where we sat in a circle, sharing carefully curated versions of our pain. Individual counseling with Dr. Whitley, head psychiatrist, a woman whose voice was as smooth and calming as freshly poured cream, yet whose eyes always held a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps pity, perhaps fear. She'd tap her pen against her ever-present clipboard, listen with an unnerving stillness, and nod slowly, as if cataloging the depths of my depravity. But healing? No. It was containment. Management. They wanted to fix us, sure, but more than that, they wanted to keep us away from normal society, to protect the world from monsters like me. And maybe they were right. The days bled into weeks, then months. Routine was the only constant. The clanging of metal doors, the bland, institutional food, the forced group activities, the endless, echoing silence broken only by the muffled sobs from another cell, or the rhythmic pacing of a restless soul in the hallway. The highlight of my day, the only thing that pierced the suffocating grayness, was that small, narrow beam of sunlight that slanted through my cell window every morning. It was a fleeting visitor, gone too soon, but it was a reminder that there was still a world outside, a world with warmth and light, even if I was forever banished from it. Then, the whisper started. Subtle at first, barely audible murmurs amongst the orderlies, hushed conversations in the hallways, glances exchanged with a nervous intensity. It began with snippets of overheard phrases, neighborhood sealed off, acting strangely, infection, spreading. I caught fragments during medication distribution, during the sparse recreation time in the fenced-in yard, during the stilted silences of group therapy. During one therapy session, Dr. Whitley attempted to maintain her usual facade of calm professional detachment. We were discussing coping mechanisms, a topic we'd circled countless times. Her voice was steady, her pen tapped rhythmically on her clipboard as she summarized someone's fabricated anxiety. But her eyes betrayed her. They darted constantly to the window behind us, flicking back and forth like trapped birds. She'd break eye contact mid-sentence, her gaze drawn to the world outside as if expecting something terrible, to appear. The tension in the room was palpable. Even the most withdrawn kids in our group seemed to sense it. A normally volatile boy, Marcus, who usually bristled at any form of authority, sat unusually still, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his chair. A girl named Sarah, who rarely spoke above a whisper, kept glancing nervously around, her eyes wide and unfocused. Dr. Whitley cut the session short. Abruptly. After only 10 minutes. All right, she announced, her voice a fraction higher than usual, a tremor beneath the surface calm. "That's enough for today. Back to your rooms, please. Wait patiently. We need to wait for further instructions." Instructions? Instructions for what? Her hurried, almost panicked escort back to our individual cells sent a chill down my spine. I'd never seen her anything but composed, in control, a bastion of professional serenity. This was different. This was fear. Later that evening, the rumors intensified, morphing from whispers to hushed, urgent pronouncements. Orderlies moved with a new kind of frantic energy, their usual detached professionalism replaced by barely concealed panic. I pressed my ear against my cell door, straining to decipher the fragments of conversations filtering through the thick steel. Infection, spreading so fast. It was Ben, a young orderly, his voice tight with fear. Heard from a guard. Hospital wards are over capacity. Acting strange as soon as they're infected. This was Maria, a slightly older orderly, her usual brisk efficiency replaced by a nervous tremor. Like they lose their minds. That night, sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. Lying on my thin cot, the scratchy blanket pulled tight around me, I listened. Through the steel door, beyond the thick walls, I could hear muffled voices, hurried footsteps. Then, a raised voice, sharp and panicked, a security guard shouting into a phone. "No, they can't just seal us in. We have minors in here, for God's sake. Minors. They need." Static crackled, swallowing the rest of his words. Then, only the sound of footsteps, quick and nervous, receding down the hallway, leaving an echoing silence in their wake. Sealed in? Minors? What was happening? Redwood Creek was on the outskirts of the city, deliberately isolated. Visitors were rare, gossip even rarer. TV privileges were restricted, a calculated form of sensory deprivation. But whatever was unfolding outside those walls, it sounded serious. And it sounded close. Too close. The next morning, the world inside Redwood Creek was irrevocably altered. Staff wore face masks, flimsy surgical masks that did little to conceal the fear in their eyes. One nurse, Nurse Davies, a kind woman who'd always offered a gentle smile and an extra moment of patience, carried a makeshift plastic shield in front of her, a clear barrier against an invisible enemy. Her eyes, usually warm and reassuring, were wide, half-wild with a terror she couldn't quite mask. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice hoarse from disuse. Is there a riot?" I half expected it. The simmering tension amongst the inmates always threatened to boil over. Nurse Davies just mumbled, "Stay in your cell," her voice barely audible, her gaze unfocused. "Stay in your cell," she repeated, walking on, her plastic shield wobbling precariously. Her eyes, they held no recognition, no warmth, just a vacant, primal fear. Total lockdown. That was the official decree. The overhead lights flickered ominously, casting long, dancing shadows down the gray hallway. Then, a crackling announcement blared from the speakers, distorted and impersonal. "Attention all residents. You must remain in your assigned rooms. This is a precautionary measure. Do not attempt to leave. We are awaiting instructions from city officials." Precautionary measure? The fear in Nurse Davies' eyes, the masks, the shield, this was no precaution. This was panic. I shot to my feet, pressing my ear against the cold steel of my cell door. From all over the ward, I could hear the rising tide of inmate unrest. Protests, shouts, banging on doors. Some were frightened, their cries laced with a childlike terror. Others were furious, their shouts filled with adolescent rage and frustration. Even hardened kids who'd committed terrible acts, nobody wanted to be caged during a crisis, trapped and helpless while the world outside unraveled. A distant siren wailed, cutting through the tension, followed by a strange, rhythmic thumping sound echoing through the walls. Boom, thump, boom, thump. It might have been staff trying to barricade entrances, reinforcing already formidable defenses. But there was something desperate, almost frantic, in the sound, something that spoke of a situation spiraling out of control. Dr. Whitley's voice, amplified and distorted by the speaker system, cut through the rising cacophony. More urgent this time, sharper, losing its carefully cultivated calm. Residents, please remain calm. We have received reports of an outbreak of unknown origin. You are safe here. We are taking every measure to protect you. Safe. Calm. Impossible. Not at all calm. Not even remotely safe. Late that afternoon, the power flickered again, then died completely, plunging the ward into a dim, unsettling twilight. My only light now came from that small, precious window, the last vestige of the outside world, the gray clouds beyond growing heavier, darker. The overhead bulbs flickered back on after what felt like an eternity, maybe 5 minutes, maybe longer, the flickering light itself a new source of anxiety, a fragile, unreliable lifeline in the encroaching darkness. It was enough to shatter what little remained of the fragile composure within Redwood Creek. The hallway outside erupted, running footsteps, heavy and panicked, slamming doors echoing down the corridor, the clang of a security gate slamming shut, a metallic shriek that reverberated through the building. I paced my small cell, heart hammering against my ribs, eyes fixed on the tiny rectangle of glass near the ceiling. The gray clouds outside were thick, oppressive, and through the gloom, I swore I saw movement in the courtyard beyond the fence. A shape, vaguely human, maybe lumbering in slow, aimless circles. I forced myself to look away, to shut it out, to not think about it. Instead, I retreated into the familiar darkness of my own mind, to the endless replay of my crime. That's what I did when anxiety threatened to overwhelm me, when fear became too sharp, too real. I relived the moment everything shattered, the instant my life irrevocably changed. I wouldn't spell it out here, not in detail. Suffice to say, I acted on a rage so potent, so blinding. It had consumed me, and it ended in a tragedy that stained my soul forever. I hadn't enjoyed it, no, but neither could I pretend it was an accident, a mistake, something unintentional. It was a choice, a terrible, conscious choice. Perhaps, deep down, I'd been harboring a desperate, irrational hope. If the world was ending, if everything was collapsing into chaos, then maybe my punishment wouldn't matter anymore. Maybe, in the face of global annihilation, my past would be rendered meaningless. Maybe I'd finally be free. But the path to that twisted kind of freedom, I quickly realized, was paved with a new kind of terror, a haunting, visceral dread that dwarfed anything I'd experienced behind bars. And then, the screams began. They started in the evening, echoing across the vast, empty cafeteria, their chilling resonance amplified by the sterile, sound-absorbing walls. Down the long, echoing corridor they traveled, seeping under cell doors, penetrating the illusion of safety, invading the deepest recesses of our fear. Those screams, they spoke of absolute, unadulterated panic. They were not screams of pain, not cries for help. They were the primal howls of souls ripped apart by terror, the sound of humanity unraveling. I leaped from my cot, pressing my face against the narrow window in my cell door, heart hammering against my ribs like a frantic drum. Down the hallway, I saw a pair of orderlies, Ben and Maria, rushing past, their faces contorted with a raw fear that mirrored the screams echoing through the building. Behind them, stumbling, lurching, came a figure in a tattered uniform. One of the orderlies, maybe. Ben was shouting back, his voice cracking with terror, "Stay back! Stay back!" But the figure didn't stop, didn't even seem to register his words. Its body moved with a sickening, jerky motion, as if the basic mechanics of human locomotion had been forgotten, corrupted. Its arms were outstretched, reaching, grasping, but there was something profoundly wrong with its eyes. Glassy, vacant, devoid of any spark of humanity. The orderlies disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the red-tinged shadows, and the figure followed, its unsettling gait echoing in the sudden silence. Then, another shape came into view, a security guard, his uniform disheveled, his face pale and slick with sweat. He clutched his side, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Under the flickering emergency lights, I glimpsed dark red droplets staining his shirt, blooming outwards like grotesque flowers. He fumbled frantically with the keypad of a locked steel door at the end of the hall, his trembling fingers struggling to input the code. The door clicked open with a loud, echoing clang. The guard lurched through, disappearing into the darkness beyond, and the heavy steel door slammed shut with a deafening thud, cutting off pursuit, but also cutting off escape. That was the last I saw of him. Something big was happening. No, bigger than big. Cataclysmic. I could feel it rattling in my chest, a cold, sickening dread that resonated with the screams, with the panicked whispers, with the empty, vacant eyes of the figure in the hallway. Hours ticked by, or maybe just minutes, time losing all meaning in the encroaching gloom. The overhead lights flickered off completely, plunging the ward into absolute darkness. And then, with a jarring suddenness, the red emergency bulbs clicked on, casting the hallway in an eerie, blood-red glow, turning the gray steel and concrete into a nightmarish landscape. That's when the real chaos erupted. Another scream, much closer this time, a woman's scream, sharp and piercing, followed by a sickening thud. Then, a nurse, it was Nurse Davies, ran past my door, her face pale as death, her body trembling violently. She fumbled at the locks of each cell, jabbing keys into metal, yanking handles open with a desperate strength born of pure terror. "You have to leave," she shrieked, her voice raw with panic, barely recognizable. "They're inside. Hurry." When she reached my door, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, she jammed the key into the lock, yanked the handle, and pulled it open. She was breathing so fast, so shallow, it sounded like she was drowning in air. I stumbled out of my cell, blinking, eyes struggling to adjust to the red, apocalyptic glow. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking, betraying the terror clawing at my throat. We're not supposed to leave. Most of the staff are gone," she panted, gesturing vaguely down the hallway. "It's not safe here. They're everywhere." She glanced around, her eyes darting nervously as kids my age and a few older teens emerged from their cells, blinking in confusion, fear etched on their faces. Some were crying softly, some were too terrified to speak, their eyes wide and hollow. I spotted Ashton, the tall, muscular boy rumored to have committed something even darker than my own crime, something whispered about in hushed, fearful tones. We locked eyes for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement of the shared terror, the shared disbelief. He looked just as startled, just as lost, as I felt. Nurse Davies kept ushering us forward, herding us like frightened sheep. "Stay together," she urged, her voice a frantic whisper. "We'll head toward the staff exit. Security gate is left unlocked, hopefully. We can get out. Are there any staff still here?" I asked, forcing the words out, the question heavy with dread. Her eyes darted behind us, as if expecting something to lunge from the shadows. "Dr. Whitley." She tried to call for help. Her voice trailed off, choked with unspeakable horror. I'm not sure." Suddenly, footsteps pounded from the far end of the corridor, heavy, uneven, and terrifyingly fast. A shape rounded the corner, a fleeting silhouette in the dim red light. We couldn't see who or what it was, only the frantic speed, the unnatural gait. Nurse Davies froze, her body rigid with fear, lifting her arms in front of her like a flimsy, useless shield. Then, the shape raced forward, closer, clearer. A staff member, her face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated panic, stumbled, fell, and tried to scramble back to her feet. But she was tackled from behind, a swift, brutal assault, by another figure that sprinted with an unnatural, stiff-limbed speed. All we could make out in the dim, blood-red light was a faint silhouette as it pinned her to the floor, its weight crushing the air from her lungs. I heard her scream, a raw, strangled cry that was abruptly cut short. Then, nothing. Only a sickening silence punctuated by ragged breaths and the pounding of our own terrified hearts. "Run!" Nurse Davies shrieked, the word ripped from her throat, a primal cry of survival. "Run!" We sprinted, blindly, past the pinned staff member, eyes averted, hearts hammering in a desperate rhythm against our ribs. Halfway down the next corridor, a metal gate loomed, a security measure used to confine residents during alerts, now standing half open, locked at an awkward, useless angle. A second nurse, a young woman named Emily, knelt frantically by the control panel, her fingers flying over buttons that no longer responded, lights that remained stubbornly dark. The overhead alarm's relentless red glow painted the entire hallway in a macabre, haunting filter. "They cut the power to the gates," the second nurse whispered, her voice trembling, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. I can't open it fully." "Then we'll squeeze through," Nurse Davies snapped, her voice regaining a semblance of control, a pragmatic edge cutting through the terror. "One by one. Hurry." One by one, we slipped through the narrow gap in the partially opened gate, contorting our bodies, scraping against the cold metal. A few of the older kids, Ashton included, offered to help, to push, to pry the gate wider, but it was jammed fast, immovable. Suddenly, we heard that same stumbling gate behind us, closer now, echoing off the steel walls. Through the narrow gap, we could see the distorted shape of something creeping closer, something unnatural, something hungry. "Move, move," Nurse Davies shouted, her voice rising in pitch again. I slid through the gate, scraping my arm against the rough metal, just as a low, guttural moan rippled through the corridor, a sound that clawed at the edges of sanity. My heart pounded so loudly, so violently, I couldn't hear anything else. The screams, the moans, even my own ragged breath. But what I glimpsed in that fleeting moment, before I squeezed through the gate, was burned into my mind forever. Pale skin, stretched taut across bone, sunken eyes, black pits in the red light, an expression devoid of humanity, devoid of anything recognizable as human. It lunged forward, blindly, instinctively, as if drawn by the slightest sound, the faintest vibration. We dashed into the next corridor, stumbling blindly, our desperate flight carrying us towards the unknown. Beyond the corridor was an outdoor courtyard, rain drizzling from the heavy, overcast sky, a cold, chilling drizzle that mirrored the dread in our hearts. In the dim light, I could make out several sets of footprints in the mud, some small, some larger, some belonging to staff who had attempted to flee earlier, their desperate escape attempts ending here, in the mud and the rain. I saw footsteps that trailed off towards the high perimeter fence, vanishing near the unscalable barrier. A few paper documents, soaked and disintegrating, were plastered to the ground, swirling in small, muddy puddles, remnants of a world that no longer existed. Nurse Davies, her breath ragged, but her resolve hardening, led us towards a large side gate, a heavy chain-link gate that opened out to the staff parking lot. In normal circumstances, it was guarded by a heavy security presence, armed guards, surveillance cameras, a constant vigilance. Now, only emptiness greeted us. The gate stood cracked open, slightly ajar, a silent invitation to the world beyond. Outside, one flickering street light, casting a weak, unreliable glow, revealed a city skyline, distant and ominous, tinted with a sickly, unnatural light. I swallowed the lump in my throat, a knot of fear and something akin to excitement. This was it, the boundary, the line I was never supposed to cross without a heavily armed escort. The staff always drilled it into us. To leave without permission meant more charges, more locked doors, a deeper descent into the system. But the system, The facility, it had collapsed. It was gone. Nothing seemed to matter anymore. A part of me felt almost dizzy, lightheaded, with the impossible possibility of stepping beyond those gates, truly free for the first time in months, years, maybe ever. A second part of me, the darker, more realistic part, remembered the label branded onto my soul, murderer. And no matter what happened out there, no matter how the world changed, that fact wouldn't change. It was a shadow that would follow me, a weight I would carry forever. We pressed forward, shoes crunching on broken glass near a guard booth, the small booth's door hanging wide open. Ripped from its hinges, something had forced its way inside, leaving deep gouge marks in the metal, a testament to brute force, to desperate hunger. Nurse Davies guided us into the parking lot, scanning frantically for any running vehicles, any signs of staff members, anyone alive. Some of the older teens, their fear momentarily overridden by a surge of adrenaline, began shouting for help, their voices echoing in the unnatural silence. But Nurse Davies frantically waved at them to be quiet, her face a mask of alarm. "You don't want to attract attention," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. That's when we heard it. A low, rasping moan, echoing off the cold concrete walls, closer now, too close. From behind a row of parked cars, four shapes emerged, stumbling in unison, arms dangling awkwardly at their sides, their movements jerky and unnatural. My heart lurched, a sickening drop in my chest, at the sight of their vacant, lifeless expressions, their pale, decaying flesh. Nurse Davies gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, stifling a scream. None of us wanted to acknowledge what they really were, what the whispers and rumors had hinted at, what our terrified minds had already begun to accept. We'd heard the stories, the panicked radio broadcasts filtering through the facility's static-laced system, the hushed orderlies' pronouncements. But seeing them, in person, up close, it was different. Horrifyingly different. They weren't in any hurry. They moved slowly, deliberately, but with an unsettling, relentless purpose, a hunger that transcended logic, transcended reason, transcended humanity itself. The small group of kids took an instinctive step back, bunching together, seeking safety in numbers, a fragile illusion in the face of overwhelming terror. I felt Ashton, the tall boy, solid and imposing, at my side, his breath shallow and rapid. He muttered, his voice barely audible, "We have to go around them." Nurse Davies nodded quickly, her eyes darting frantically, pointing in the opposite direction, towards a narrow gap between two rows of cars. But we only made it a few steps before we realized there were more of those figures, more of the infected, behind us, staggering from the shadows of the parked cars, emerging from the spaces between buildings, a slow, inexorable tide of decaying flesh and mindless hunger. They formed a loose, menacing half-circle, cutting off our escape routes, closing in with horrifying inevitability. Without warning, one of the older teens, Marco, his eyes wide with panic, his face slick with sweat, bolted. He darted between two cars, sprinting towards the perimeter fence, a foolish, desperate gamble for escape. "Marco, no!" Nurse Davies called after him, her voice cracking with despair, but he kept running, heedless of her warning, driven by a primal instinct to flee, to escape, no matter the cost. A shape lurched out from behind the chain-link fence, a figure we hadn't seen before, emerging from the shadows with terrifying speed, catching Marco completely off guard. I turned away, instinctively, unable to bear witness to what happened next, the gruesome, inevitable fate that awaited him. "As quietly as you can," Nurse Davies whispered, her voice tight with urgency, pointing at a narrow opening to a side road, a dark alleyway near the edge of the parking lot, a sliver of hope in the overwhelming darkness. "We'll slip through there. Now, move." We moved carefully, silently as we could manage, our feet crunching softly on broken glass and gravel, the shapes in the parking lot, thankfully, seemed to have trouble moving quickly, their jerky, unnatural gait hindering their pursuit. We hoped, desperately, to get around them unseen, to slip into the alleyway before they fully surrounded us. I forced myself not to look back at Marco, at the place where he'd vanished behind the fence. Deep down, a cold, heavy weight settled in my stomach, a sickening certainty. I knew I couldn't save him, couldn't save any of us, perhaps. We moved between parked cars, keeping low, crouching behind bumpers, our breath thundering in our ears, each footstep amplified in the unnerving silence of the deserted parking lot. At one point, as we crept past a late-model sedan, I glanced through the car window and saw them. Keys, hanging from the ignition, dangling temptingly, a symbol of escape, of freedom, of a desperate chance for survival. My heart skipped a beat, a surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. Maybe we could drive away. But I was 15. I didn't know the first thing about driving. The thought died as quickly as it sparked, a fleeting fantasy extinguished by harsh reality. Eventually, miraculously, we made it to the side road's tall fence, the chain-link gate slightly ajar. Nurse Davies and Ashton, their muscles straining, helped pull the heavy gate aside, creating just enough room for me and another kid, a small, wiry boy named David, to slip through. Only after we were all out, safely on the other side of the gate, huddled in the shadows of the alleyway, did I finally notice how utterly, terrifyingly quiet the city seemed. No distant hum of traffic, no blare of horns, no voices, no sounds of human life. Just a low, mournful breeze whistling through the deserted streets, and the occasional, distant moan carried on the wind, a chilling reminder of the horrors lurking in the shadows. We ventured cautiously onto the main street, the flickering lamp posts casting long, unreliable shadows that danced and shifted with the breeze. Some storefronts still had their lights on, ghostly beacons in the encroaching darkness, but the windows were shattered, gaping holes revealing ransacked interiors, the remnants of panicked looting. Vehicles sat abandoned in the middle of the road, doors flung open, as if the drivers had simply fled, abandoning everything in a desperate scramble for survival. The entire area felt deserted, hollowed out, like a ghost town, haunted by the silent specters of its former inhabitants, curtains and broken windows swaying eerily in the wind like restless spirits. We huddled together near the curb, scanning the deserted streets, desperately searching for a path forward, any sign of hope in the overwhelming despair. I still stuck close to Nurse Davies, unconsciously gravitating towards her. She was our only real tether to the world of adults, to the remnants of order and authority in this chaotic new reality. Then, through the gloom, I caught sight of a distant group, maybe half a block away, moving slowly, erratically. At first, a flicker of hope sparked in my chest. Survivors? Could it be? But the way they moved, in fits and starts, the jerky, swaying posture, the shuffling gait, it told a different, more horrifying story. They were more of the infected, drifting aimlessly amongst the deserted cars, their mindless hunger drawing them towards. What? Sound? Movement? Life itself? Nurse Davies motioned for us to stay quiet, pressing a finger to her lips, guiding us around the corner, into the relative safety of a side street, away from the potential threat. We walked in single file, close to the buildings, our footsteps muffled on the cracked pavement, trying not to draw attention, every sound, every shadow, putting us on edge, our nerves stretched taut as violin strings. A loud crash nearby made us freeze, hearts leaping into our throats. But it turned out to be just a loose metal sign, ripped from its moorings by the wind, clattering to the ground. The tension was unbearable, suffocating. As we turned another corner, rounding a deserted storefront, I saw movement again, closer this time. Near a bus stop, a small group, maybe 6, maybe 7, figures standing motionless in the flickering light. I couldn't tell, not at this distance, in this gloom, if they were survivors, like us, or something else. Then, one of them moved, shifting its weight from one foot to the other, and the unmistakable jerky, swaying posture, the unnatural angle of its limbs, revealed the terrifying truth. more infected. Closer now. Too close. We waited, frozen in place, until they were far enough away, drifting aimlessly down the street, before tiptoeing along a row of parked cars, keeping low, our breath catching in our throats with each agonizing step. My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic drumbeat threatening to burst through my ribs, echoing the silent scream trapped in my lungs. The grocery store's parking lot was a scene of utter disarray. Abandoned cars strewn haphazardly, doors hanging open, smashed windows glinting ominously in the dim light. The main doors of the store themselves looked wide open, a gaping maw in the darkened building, one glass panel shattered into a million glittering shards, scattered across the sidewalk like fallen stars. We hurried towards the building, our desperate hope outweighing the obvious danger. Inside the grocery store, most of the aisles were plunged into near-total darkness, the only illumination provided by scattered emergency lighting, flickering erratically, casting long, distorted shadows, revealing rows of empty shelves, picked clean, ransacked by panicked survivors, or perhaps by something else entirely. It seemed like the place had been thoroughly looted, every valuable item stripped bare, every resource exhausted. There were scattered items on the floor, discarded, unwanted, a few spilled cartons of spoiled milk, the air thick with the cloying, sickly sweet stench of decay. Yet, in the back of the store, in the dimmest, most neglected corner, we found a small area near the produce section where, miraculously, canned goods had been left behind, overlooked in the frenzy of the initial panic. A forgotten hoard of potential sustenance. While Nurse Davies and a couple of the older teens went to search for a flashlight, their footsteps echoing eerily in the vast emptiness of the store, I stumbled upon a half-open storage closet, tucked away behind a display of wilting, abandoned lettuce. Inside, stacked neatly in cardboard boxes, were bottles of water, cases upon cases of bottled water, presumably overlooked in the chaos, a veritable oasis in this desolate landscape. "Water," I called out, my voice echoing surprisingly loudly in the cavernous store. "Ashton, water. Over here." Ashton, his face grimy and pale, but his eyes still sharp and alert, appeared beside me in moments. Together, we managed to carry several boxes of bottled water back to the small group huddled near the produce section, their faces illuminated by the flickering emergency lights, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and apprehension. A few other kids, encouraged by our discovery, began rummaging through the scattered debris, searching for any snacks that weren't stale, any scraps of nourishment in the desolate wasteland of the grocery store. We all congregated in the center of the store, near the deserted produce section, the remnants of wilted vegetables scattered on the floor like forgotten casualties. Nurse Davies, having found a small, battery-powered flashlight, its beam weak and unreliable, but still a beacon in the darkness, passed around the water bottles, her movements slow and deliberate, her face etched with fatigue. Everyone drank greedily, gulping down the life-sustaining liquid. My own throat felt raw and sore from nerves, from fear, from the gnawing thirst that had become a constant companion. Then, Ashton, his face unreadable, offered me a half-eaten bag of chips he'd scavenged, a small act of unexpected kindness in this brutal new world. I realized, with a sudden, sharp pang of hunger, that I was starving, truly, deeply starving. I tore the bag open, thankful for the bland, greasy, but utterly comforting taste, the familiar crunch of small solace in the overwhelming chaos. It was a quiet moment, a fleeting respite, in a storm of unimaginable chaos. 8 kids and a nurse, huddled together in the half-lit, looted remains of a grocery store, seeking temporary refuge in the heart of a dying city. For a split second, a fragile, impossible second, I almost forgot the world outside, the screams, the infected, the relentless, encroaching darkness. I almost forgot my guilt, my past, my label, my sentence. Then, the lights flickered again, more violently this time, plunging the store into near darkness before stuttering back to life, the unreliable emergency bulbs casting even longer, more menacing shadows. And then, the big overhead windows near the entrance, shattered and broken, rattled violently in their frames, a low, ominous vibration that resonated through the entire building. Something was there. Outside, moaning, a low, guttural moan that drifted through the broken glass, carried on the wind, a sound that chilled the blood and tightened the grip of fear around our hearts. The infected. They had wandered in, drawn by our movement, perhaps, or the rustling of plastic bags, the faint sounds of human life in the echoing silence. Silhouettes loomed at the entrance, dark, indistinct shapes against the gloom. 1, 2, maybe 5, maybe 6. It was impossible to tell in the flickering, unreliable light. The small group collectively tensed, their fragile moment of respite shattered, the illusion of safety ripped away. Nurse Davies gestured urgently for us to stay behind her, her small, battery-powered flashlight beam wavering nervously as she took a slow, cautious step toward the aisle, her face pale but determined, bracing herself to face whatever horrors lay beyond the produce section. We tried to stay perfectly still, holding our breath, hoping against hope that the infected would stumble by, mindlessly, aimlessly, without noticing us, hidden in the dim light, huddled in the ruins of a grocery store. But then, David, the small, wiry boy, his nerves frayed to breaking point, accidentally kicked a fallen can, a discarded soup can lying unnoticed on the floor. The metallic clank, sharp and loud, echoed through the vast, silent store, reverberating off the empty shelves, a sound amplified in the oppressive quiet, a death knell in the gathering darkness. Instantly, the silhouettes at the entrance jerked, their indistinct forms shifting in our direction. Several of them broke into a stiff, unnatural run, a jerky, unsettling gait that sent a fresh wave of terror washing over us. Back, Nurse Davies whispered urgently, her voice cracking with fear. Then louder, sharper, her voice rising above the growing panic. Back. Run. Now. We bolted, scrambling to our feet, knocking over displays of canned goods, scattering uneaten bags of chips, our desperate flight echoing through the empty store. Weaving blindly between aisles, dodging overturned shopping carts, our breath coming in ragged gasps, the infected lurched after us, their unnatural limbs swinging wildly, their moans growing louder, closer, more insistent. We could hear them behind us, stumbling through the debris, knocking over displays, scattering boxes and cans, their relentless pursuit a terrifying soundtrack to our desperate escape. One of the older teens, a lanky boy named Ben, tripped over a toppled trash bin, crashing to the floor with a jarring thud. Ashton, without hesitation, without a word, reached down, grabbed Ben's arm, and hauled him back to his feet, pulling him forward, urging him to keep running. Meanwhile, Nurse Davies, her flashlight beam dancing wildly, tried to lead us towards a faint, illuminated exit sign at the rear of the store, a flickering beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. My stomach clenched, a knot of icy dread tightening within me as the footsteps and moans of our pursuers grew closer, louder, more immediate, filling the echoing store with their terrifying presence. We dashed through a stockroom door, Nurse Davies shoving it shut behind us with a desperate heave. There was no lock, just a broken latch, useless against the relentless hunger of the infected. Ashton and I, our adrenaline surging, pressed our bodies against the door, straining to hold it closed, the flimsy wood shuddering under the relentless pounding from the other side, the sickening thuds echoing through the stockroom, growing louder, more insistent, threatening to splinter the wood, to give way to the horrors beyond. Move. Nurse Davies gasped, her face pale and strained, her eyes wide with terror. We need another way out. Now. A narrow hallway, barely visible in the dim light, led deeper into the stockroom's labyrinthine depths. Another sign, small and faded, indicated a set of stairs. This way, I shouted, pointing towards the stairs, my voice cracking with urgency, barely audible above the pounding on the stockroom door. Stairs. This way. The small group, their faces etched with terror, rushed towards the stairs, a desperate scramble for survival, their footsteps echoing frantically on the concrete floor. We plunged down a flight of stairs, descending into the unknown, the pounding on the stockroom door above growing even louder, more frenzied, threatening to overwhelm us. The stairs led to a loading dock, a dimly lit concrete platform shrouded in shadows. A heavy steel door, the only exit, barred our way, locked with a thick, rusty chain. One of the older kids, a resourceful teen named Chris, grabbed a broken piece of metal from the floor, a jagged shard of a shattered display case, and began to pry at the chain, his movements frantic, desperate, while we waited, huddled together, hearts pounding like trapped birds. The sound of the infected tearing through the stockroom door above, the splintering wood, the crashing displays, filling the air with a terrifying symphony of impending doom. "Hurry," Nurse Davies urged, her voice strained, her eyes darting nervously towards the sounds of destruction above. "Faster!" Behind us, above us, the stockroom door burst open with a deafening crash, splintering wood flying through the air, and the scraping, shuffling footsteps of the infected poured through the gaping hole, descending towards the stairs, their relentless pursuit closing in. "The chain!" Chris shouted, his voice triumphant, desperate. It snapped. The heavy door to the loading dock swung outward with a groan of rusty hinges, revealing the dimly lit alleyway beyond, a narrow passage of shadows and uncertain escape. We rushed through the open door, a chaotic scramble for freedom, stumbling onto the concrete ramp that led to the outside alley, collapsing into the night air, gasping for breath, our lungs burning, our hearts racing, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and terror. A few infected milled around the far end of the alleyway, their indistinct shapes barely visible in the dim light. But thankfully, they hadn't spotted us yet, their attention drawn, perhaps, to the sounds of destruction within the grocery store. We took a desperate chance and sprinted in the opposite direction, ducking behind dumpsters, weaving through the narrow path of the alleyway, seeking refuge in the darkness, our breath ragged, our hearts racing, the sounds of pursuit, thankfully, fading behind us. Finally, we emerged onto another street, another deserted thoroughfare, lit only by sporadic, unreliable street lamps, casting long, dancing shadows, revealing a city reduced to a ghost of its former self. Everyone looked exhausted, their faces pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, their eyes hollow with fear and fatigue. Nurse Davies nearly collapsed, her legs giving way beneath her, and we rushed to her side, helping her to a nearby bench, a small island of temporary respite in the vast ocean of chaos. In that moment, feeling my chest burn from the desperate run, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, the terror still clinging to me like a shroud, I understood something profound, something terrifyingly simple. Every living human was fighting the same battle now, regardless of their past, regardless of their crimes, regardless of their labels. We were all just trying to survive. That was the new reality. Survival at any cost. But even as that realization dawned, a cold, hard truth settled in my stomach, a familiar, unwelcome weight. I was a murderer. I'd taken a life. And no outbreak, no apocalypse, no end of the world could ever erase that. In the old world, that meant I was locked up, contained, separated from society, deemed too dangerous to be free. But in this new world, in this broken, terrifying world, it seemed nobody cared anymore. The infected didn't care about my past, didn't care about my crimes, didn't care about the label branded onto my soul. To them, I was just another living, breathing person, another source of potential food, target. It didn't matter. The past was irrelevant now. Only survival mattered. I caught Ashton glancing at me, his gaze surprisingly gentle, his expression filled with a weariness that mirrored my own. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind. I nodded slowly, hesitantly. "Yeah," I lied, my voice hoarse. "Yeah, I'm okay." "You're not," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the deserted street stretching out before us. "None of us are." He shook his head slowly, a gesture of weary resignation. I guess I'm not used to all this," I mumbled, the words inadequate, meaningless, failing to capture the enormity of the situation, the sheer scale of the horror. He laughed then, a short, hollow sound devoid of humor, devoid of hope. "Who is?" he whispered, his gaze distant, lost in the shadows of the dying city. We both stared down the dark street, broken glass shimmering like fallen stars under the weak glow of a distant street lamp, indistinct shapes wandering aimlessly in the shadows, the silent specters of a world consumed by death. Once she caught her breath, Nurse Davies stood, her face pale but her resolve hardening, a new kind of determination flickering in her eyes. "We need to find somewhere to stay for the night," she announced, her voice regaining a semblance of authority, of purpose. "A building, somewhere with only one or two entrances. Somewhere we can block them off. Somewhere safe." The word hung in the air, heavy with irony, a desperate plea for something that likely no longer existed. We pressed forward, driven by a primal need for shelter, for security, for even a fleeting illusion of safety in the darkened city blocks. Eventually, after what felt like hours of aimless wandering, we spotted it. A large church, its stone walls thick and imposing, its heavy wooden doors seemingly impenetrable, its windows high, stained glass mostly intact, a silent sanctuary amidst the surrounding chaos. It seemed safer, sturdier, than the other flimsy storefronts and shattered office buildings we'd passed, a beacon of potential refuge in the gathering darkness. We approached the churchyard cautiously, our footsteps echoing eerily on the deserted sidewalk. The fence surrounding the churchyard was tall, wrought iron, and locked, but Ashton, his muscles taut, scaled it with surprising agility, dropping down on the other side with a soft thud. He pushed from within, straining against the rusted latch, and managed to unhook it. The heavy gate groaning open with a loud, protesting creak that seemed to echo through the silent city, a sound that made us all flinch, fearing it would draw unwanted attention. We hurried through the gate, grateful for the sudden, relative security of the churchyard, the high fence a flimsy barrier against the horrors lurking beyond. We approached the massive church doors, our breath held captive in our lungs, the air thick with anticipation and dread. The door was slightly ajar, a dark crack in the heavy wood, as if someone, desperate or careless, had forced it open, leaving a silent invitation or a silent warning. Inside, the main hall was deserted, bathed in shadows, the air thick with the scent of dust and old wood. A few broken pews lay scattered across the worn stone floor, casualties of chaos, but the sturdy doors seemed solid, the stained glass windows high and largely intact, offering a semblance of protection from the outside world. The church, it felt empty, silent, but not entirely devoid of a strange, unsettling peace, a sanctuary amidst the storm. "Seems clear," Nurse Davies announced, her voice low, cautious, after a hurried, whispered reconnaissance with a couple of the older teens, checking the side doors, the shadows, the hidden corners of the vast church. Let's settle here for a while. We can rest, figure out our next move in the morning." And so we did. We used broken pews, overturned chairs, and a few heavy, forgotten religious objects we found near the altar to barricade the massive wooden doors, creating a makeshift barrier against the unknown terrors lurking outside. We found a couple of dusty candles near the altar, miraculously untouched by the chaos, and lit them, the flickering flames casting a weak, dancing light, dispelling some of the oppressive darkness, offering a small measure of comfort. Everyone huddled together in the main hall, seeking warmth, seeking solace in shared fear, their breathing loud in the unaccustomed silence. But a few hours later, I woke with a start, my heart pounding, the silence deeper now, more profound, and something wrong. I blinked, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dim candlelight, and realized that Nurse Davies was gone. Vanished. So were two others, Ben and Emily, the two nurses who had been our guides, our protectors, our last link to the old world. A soft breeze drifted in through the side door of the church, a chilling gust of outside air, and I saw, with a growing sense of dread, that the side door, which we thought we'd secured, was left slightly open, swaying gently in the wind. I had no idea where they went, why they left. For a moment, a flicker of desperate hope ignited in my chest. Maybe she was trying to find help, to summon rescue. Or maybe she'd simply lost hope, given in to despair. Or maybe something had lured them outside, something unseen, something deadly, something that whispered promises of false safety in the darkness. None of us knew. We waited, huddled in the dim candlelight, the silence of the church amplifying our growing fear, our sense of abandonment, our gnawing uncertainty. She never came back. We searched the surrounding hallways of the church, the echoing vestry, the shadowy side rooms, calling her name in hushed, desperate tones. Nurse Davies? Ben? Emily? Our voices echoed unanswered, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the church, the silence broken only by the creaking of old wood and the frantic pounding of our own hearts. We found no trace of her or the others, only that open door at the side, leading out into the dim, silent city, a gaping maw of uncertainty and dread. Some of the kids, panicked and hungry, suggested we move on immediately, venture back into the city, search for food, for supplies, for other survivors. Others, paralyzed by fear, clinging to the false security of the church, argued that we should wait until dawn, stay put, hope for rescue, hope for something. We voted a hushed, whispered vote in the flickering candlelight and decided, with a heavy sense of resignation, to stay until sunrise. Traveling in darkness, we reasoned, was too risky, too dangerous, a reckless gamble in a city teeming with unseen horrors. We took turns keeping watch at the high, stained glass windows, peering out into the oppressive darkness, our eyes strained, our nerves frayed, our exhaustion weighing on us like a physical burden. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the infected lurking outside, unseen in the shadows, or the guilt that followed me everywhere, a constant, silent companion, a shadow I could never outrun. Morning light, weak and gray, crept through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, revealing the stark emptiness of the church hall, the scattered pews, the makeshift barricade, our fragile illusion of safety. Peering cautiously through the stained glass, we noticed faint shapes moving outside the church fence, indistinct figures shuffling aimlessly, possibly more infected, drawn by the sounds of our arrival, perhaps. They seemed unaware of our presence within the church, or perhaps indifferent, their mindless hunger driving them in aimless circles, searching, always searching. We gathered what little supplies we had scavenged, the few bottles of water, the half-eaten bag of chips, the stale crackers we'd found in a forgotten pew, and prepared to leave the fragile sanctuary of the church to face the uncertain terrors of the outside world once more. Nobody said it aloud, but we all felt an invisible weight, a crushing sense of loss, now that Nurse Davies was gone, vanished into the night, leaving us adrift, orphaned in a world devoured by death. She was our link to the old world, to the rules, the structure, the remnants of humanity we'd once known. Without her, we were just kids, alone, terrified, and utterly lost. We exited through the front doors of the church, pushing aside our makeshift barricade, the heavy pews scraping against the stone floor, the sound echoing eerily in the morning silence. The day was gray and silent, the city's rooftops bathed in a dull, ominous glow, the air heavy with a damp chill. We moved carefully through the church courtyard, scanning for threats, our eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow, our footsteps echoing on the deserted pavement. As we made our way down the street, the silence was almost unbearable, a suffocating blanket of stillness broken only by the rustling of wind and the distant, unsettling moans carried on the breeze. We passed cars that had been abandoned in the middle of the road, some with doors flung open, empty, silent testimonies to panicked flight, but no sign of their owners, no trace of human life. Papers fluttered across the cracked asphalt, swirling in small, aimless circles, like lost souls in a world devoid of direction. Occasionally, in the distance, we spotted one or two zombies, stumbling erratically, turning in slow, mindless circles, their vacant eyes fixed on nothing, their hunger insatiable. We tried to keep our footsteps quiet, our movements minimal, desperately attempting to avoid drawing their attention. No one spoke. The tension was suffocating, pressing down on us like a physical weight, and I couldn't stop my mind from wandering back to the reason I was locked up in the first place, the crime that had defined me, the label that clung to me like a curse. In the span of a few short days, the entire system that had caged me, the walls that had confined me, the rules that had bound me, had collapsed, vanished, ceased to exist. I was free now. Technically, physically. But did I deserve it? Did freedom mean anything in a world like this? Was there even a world left to be free in? As we moved past a small park, overgrown and deserted, a girl about my age, Sky, the quiet girl from group therapy, fell into step beside me, her face pale and drawn, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. She looked up at me, her gaze direct, surprisingly intense, her voice barely a whisper. "I've heard rumors about you," she said, her words hanging in the silent air between us. I stiffened, my breath catching in my throat, my muscles tensing involuntarily. Rumors? What kind of rumors? And who had been spreading them? "They say you ended someone's life." Her words hung in the air, accusatory, judgmental, echoing the silent condemnation that haunted my own thoughts. I didn't reply, couldn't reply. What could I say? Deny it? Lie? The truth was etched onto my soul, undeniable, inescapable. I didn't lie either. I just kept walking, my gaze fixed on the cracked pavement ahead, my silence a confession, an admission of guilt, a burden too heavy to bear. We kept walking in silence for a long, agonizing moment, the tension between us thick and suffocating, the weight of my past pressing down on me, heavier than ever. After a long, drawn-out silence, she spoke again, her voice still quiet, but softer now, less accusatory, more understanding. "You did something wrong," she said, her words hanging in the air like fragile leaves. "So did I. So did Ashton. So did everyone in that building. Doesn't mean we can't try to do better." I took a shaky breath, the air catching in my lungs, a knot of emotion tightening in my throat. "I don't know if I can," I whispered, my voice barely audible, raw with guilt and self-doubt. "That kind of thing, it doesn't just go away." She nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on me, her gaze surprisingly unwavering, filled with a strange mixture of sadness and hope. "No," she agreed softly. "It doesn't go away. But maybe now, in this new world, we can try to help each other." Her words sank in slowly, like rain seeping into parched earth, offering a glimmer of something unexpected, something akin to forgiveness? Redemption? I had no idea what my future held, no idea if I would even make it through the next day. But it was the first time since the world had fallen apart that someone had suggested, even hinted, that I might still have a chance at redemption, a chance to make a different choice than the one I had made before, the choice that had shattered everything. Eventually, our small, fractured group reached a crossroads, a stark junction in the deserted city streets. To one side, a stretch of highway, cracked and overgrown, led out of the city, towards the unknown, towards a potential escape from the urban wasteland. To the other, the heart of downtown loomed, a cluster of tall buildings, skyscrapers reaching towards the gray sky, like silent guardians, a potential source of what? Hope? Danger? We had no idea what lay beyond the city limits, no idea if the highway led to safety or more peril, but there was a chance, a desperate hope, that it was less populated, less overrun by the infected, a chance to escape the urban nightmare. Yet, downtown, the heart of the dying city, might also hold remnants of organized help, emergency centers, military outposts, relief convoys, a chance for rescue, however slim. Ashton and a few others, the more pragmatic, survival-oriented members of our group, wanted to head for the highway, believing we'd find fewer infected in the less densely populated areas, a better chance of evading the hordes. Sky and a couple more, driven by a desperate flicker of hope, thought heading into the city center might lead to organized help, military intervention, or some form of relief, a gamble on the possibility of rescue amidst the ruins. That left me, standing at the crossroads, torn between two uncertain paths. My decision, my voice, would be the deciding vote, the tipping point that would determine our collective fate. Half the group, Ashton's faction, waited anxiously for my answer, their faces etched with weariness and apprehension. Sky and her small group waited too, their eyes fixed on me, their hope fragile but unwavering. I looked at both paths, stretching out before me, each one uncertain, each one shrouded in shadows, each one offering a different kind of risk, a different kind of desperate hope. I opened my mouth to speak, to voice my decision, to choose our path, but no words came out. My throat felt tight, constricted, paralyzed by indecision, by the weight of responsibility, by the overwhelming uncertainty of it all. At first, only the wind, a mournful, desolate breeze, swept dust across the cracked pavement, swirling around our feet, a silent testament to the city's decay. In the distance, a lone infected figure shuffled aimlessly by a burnt-out car, a fleeting, chilling reminder of the ever-present danger. For a long, agonizing moment, standing at that crossroads, paralyzed by indecision, by fear, by guilt, I remembered the expression on my victim's face, the last flicker of life, the fading light in their eyes, all those months ago, back when everything was normal, back when the world made sense. The memory stung, a sharp, visceral pain that pierced through the numbness, and I almost felt unworthy to make such a decision, unworthy to choose our path, unworthy to even be alive. Then, amidst the swirling dust and the echoing silence, I thought of how the zombie outbreak had, in a terrible, twisted way, leveled all the rules, all the structures, all the expectations of the old world. I was no longer an inmate, no longer bound by Redwood Creek's steel bars, no longer confined by society's walls, no longer defined by my past. Did that mean I was truly free? Or just a lost? Utterly, irrevocably lost, adrift in a sea of chaos and death, with no compass, no map, no guide? I glanced at the worn, worried faces around me, the small group of kids, of teens, their faces reflecting my own fear, my own uncertainty, my own desperate yearning for direction, for hope, for something, anything, to cling to. We were just kids. Well, teens, barely more than children, thrust into a world gone mad, forced to make impossible choices, to shoulder burdens too heavy to bear. But we had to decide. Our fate, our survival, depended on it now. My throat felt tighter, more constricted, the words trapped, unspoken, suffocating me from the inside out. I began, my voice cracking, barely audible, then trailed off, the decision still unresolved, the path still unclear. No matter which path I chose, highway or downtown, it wouldn't guarantee safety, wouldn't offer any real certainty, wouldn't promise survival. But we couldn't keep standing there, frozen at the crossroads, paralyzed by fear and indecision. We had to move. We had to choose. I turned to them then, to Ashton, to Sky, to the small group of survivors waiting for my word, my direction, my fate. Exhaling slowly, forcing the words past the lump in my throat, I spoke, my voice still shaky, still uncertain, but firm enough, decisive enough, to finally break the suffocating silence. I think we should. Then, a low, guttural moan rumbled from somewhere behind us, a chilling sound that cut through the air, erasing my words, shattering the fragile moment of decision. Instinctively, we all turned, our heads snapping around, our eyes widening with fresh terror. Several infected, a small horde of them, had emerged from a side street, drawn by the sight of us, perhaps or simply wandering aimlessly in our direction, their moaning a prelude to a desperate, mindless attack. "Go," Ashton hissed, his voice sharp with urgency, his fear overriding his hesitation, his pragmatic survival instinct kicking in. "Run." Now, we broke into a run, a chaotic, panicked scattering, hearts pounding like war drums, adrenaline surging through our veins, each of us instinctively scattering in the direction each had last advocated for, highway or downtown, our fractured group splitting apart at the crossroads, our fragile unity shattered by the sudden onslaught of terror. In the panic, in the frantic scramble for escape, I saw shapes passing me in both directions, fleeting glimpses of Ashton and a few others sprinting towards the highway, Skye and her small group dashing towards downtown, our paths diverging, our fates separating, perhaps forever. For a moment, I froze, caught in the cross-current of fleeing figures, the moans of the pursuing infected echoing behind me, the shouts of my companions fading into the distance, lost in the chaos. Figures stumbled after us, arms outstretched, reaching blindly, their eyes empty, vacant, their moans echoing in the deserted streets, a chilling symphony of death and despair. I was a murderer. The old world told me that meant I'd lost my right to live freely amongst everyone else, that I deserved to be caged, to be contained, to be punished. Now, in this new reality, everything was inverted, turned upside down, shattered into pieces. There were no more guards, no more fences, no more rules, no more laws, no more societal structures to define me, to condemn me, to control me. There was just survival. I looked one last time at Ashton, his figure receding in the distance, waving at me frantically, urging me to follow him towards the highway, a path towards uncertain safety, towards the unknown. Skye ran the other way, towards the city's heart, a desperate gamble for rescue amidst the ruins, a hope that flickered like a dying ember. Then, my legs began to move almost on their own, propelled by instinct, by adrenaline, by a primal urge to survive. I sprinted, weaving through abandoned cars, dodging overturned debris, ignoring the shouts and cries fading behind me, focusing only on escape, on survival, on putting distance between myself and the pursuing horrors. I vaulted over a low barricade, my muscles straining, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The infected were close behind. I could hear them, their moans growing louder, closer, more insistent, but I couldn't spare a glance, couldn't afford to look back. The road stretched out ahead, a strip of cracked asphalt leading into the unknown, towards the horizon, towards a potential escape from the dying city. Buildings loomed in the other direction, the towering skyscrapers of downtown, just as dark, just as uncertain, just as potentially dangerous. Behind me, a few zombie figures snatched at the air, their grasping hands reaching for empty space, their moans echoing in the deserted streets. But they were too slow, too clumsy, too dead. My feet pounded the pavement, the hard impact jarring my bones, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins gave me speed, gave me strength, gave me a fleeting sense of freedom. In that moment, amidst the terror, amidst the chaos, amidst the desperate flight for survival, I realized the outbreak had, in a terrible, twisted way, given me something I never would have had before, something I never deserved, something I never expected. A chance to run free. No more steel bars. No more watchful guards. No more judgment. No more condemnation. No more labels. But I also felt the crushing weight of responsibility, the terrifying burden of choice, the gnawing question that throbbed in my mind, louder than the pounding of my heart, more insistent than the moans of the pursuing infected. What would I do with this freedom? Would I be no better than before, a monster in human skin, hurting others for my own survival, driven by rage and desperation? Or could I redeem myself? Could I find a path towards something better, something more, in this broken, shattered world? Could I learn to protect those around me, to help others, to make different choices now? Choices that were not defined by rage, by guilt, by the darkness of my past? I glanced over my shoulder. Just for a fleeting moment, the small group of infected was falling behind, their shambling gait no match for the adrenaline-fueled sprint of a desperate teenager. Ahead, the empty road called me forward, a strip of asphalt leading into the unknown, a blank canvas upon which I would have to paint my own future. The pounding in my chest, the burning in my lungs, the wind whipping through my hair, these were all reminders, visceral, undeniable, that I was still alive, still human. I pushed forward, running faster, harder, driven by a desperate hope, a fragile possibility, and a terrifying uncertainty. Wind whipping through my hair, a swirl of dust kicked up around me, obscuring the cracked pavement, blurring the edges of the dying city. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, a chaotic torrent of fear, guilt, hope, and despair, but I wasn't sure what came next, where this road would lead, what future awaited me at the end of this desperate flight. Would I find a new life on the highway, away from the infected cities, a life of solitude, of survival, of what? Redemption? Or just more running? Would I cross paths with Ashton again? Or Sky? Or anyone else who had once shared that gray, silent facility, that prison masquerading as a rehabilitation center? I didn't know. I had no answers. What I did know, with a chilling certainty, was this: I was a murderer. Yet, in a twisted, unimaginable turn of fate, the undead had broken the walls around me, shattered my prison, and set me free. Now, I was out in a world where the rules were shattered, where society had collapsed, where only survival mattered, and where the line between monster and human had blurred beyond recognition. Maybe I could start over. Maybe I could find a better path. Or maybe I would become a monster, worse than any infected creature, driven by desperation, by guilt, by the raw, primal need to survive, no matter the cost. With each step I took down that lonely, deserted stretch of asphalt, I felt the burning question growing, expanding, consuming me from the inside out. Who am I now? Who will I become? I may never know how this story ends, but for the first time in my life, perhaps, I was free to find out. Thank you for listening. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps this channel alive, and who knows, maybe we'll revisit Caleb's journey in part 2? Let me know in the comments if you want to see what happens next on that lonely highway. Until next time, stay vigilant. And remember, curiosity can be quite the companion, and sometimes a curse.